And once again, we have this question: what's the fundamental role of government? So what's the analog to assigning property rights in the environment? It would be assigning property rights in intellectual development, in innovation. That's why we have a patent system. So we may just say, look, we're not going to get directly involved in research, but we will develop a well-functioning patent system so that people who invest in innovation appropriate the benefits of it. Then we let the private market take over. But again, the problem is much of what we see is of a general interest, science research, social science research, and so on. So we may, here's just an example of a private innovation for which we might want to be able to provide patents. Now, I apologize. There we go. So oftentimes the government is much more directly involved in directing research and determining the goals of research. So it sets those research goals and provides resources and incentives. How does that look? Well, we still have these two fundamental dimensions, dimensions 3 and 4. You have to decide who gets to decide how this research is conducted and who's going to pay for it. So we can imagine a range of policy instruments to do this, all the way from on the upper right side, we've got pure government research. The government has research centers. On the other extreme, we have what are called X prizes, where the government sets up a prize and says the first one to develop this invention or this product, for example, a refrigerator of a specified efficiency that can be produced at lower than a specified cost. This is an actual X prize, will receive $1 million. And that's a surprisingly effective policy tool for getting private parties engaged in research. But in between, we have an entire range of policy instruments where discretion is shared, where the where the government and private sectors work together, going back and forth over the conduct of the research. Now, I used to think that the only way that research got done was when the government paid for it. The only way the government could induce research was by paying for it. But then I realized that the REACH program in the EU actually tells companies you must engage in research on any chemicals that you use in your products. Now, they don't tell them exactly how to do it. There's a certain amount of shared discretion, but they direct them to do it at their own expense and to publish the results of that research so the public knows what are the hazards associated with those chemicals. So, what would be some examples? Okay, it's a little fanciful, but maybe the government could say, we want to develop industrial processes for post-consumer use of plastic bags, going to our example. So we want to find ways to turn plastic bags into usable products, if you consider this dress usable, or this fashionable handbag made out of plastic bag. So the government could set out, here's the direction we want. We want you to engage in this research. We'll help pay for it, and we'll collaborate on how that research gets done. So the point is that even once you've decided that you need research and development, you need innovation, the job isn't done. You still have to choose your policy instruments. Similarly, if the issue is one of information, we recognize that there's a broad range of policy instruments for doing this. Just saying information is an instrument is misleading, because the fact is we still have to figure out how that information gets into the hands of decision makers. And once again, we have this question, so what are the fundamental roles the government could take in this? And once again, the first role is entitlement assigning, but it's with a bit of a twist. It's setting up the rules for information exchange. So the government sets up libel and slander laws, antitrust laws for how information gets shared between firms, and truth in advertising laws. And so one of the things that the government can do is just set up the rules and say, now, private sector, You take care of this. You work out the information regimes. Now, if you think that that can't happen, think about the Environmental Defense Fund going after McDonald's and saying, you need to stop using styrofoam clamshells on your Big Macs. They said they would make McDonald's miserable if they didn't do that. And there are limits to what they can do. Or think about Greenpeace going after Hershey for orangutan habitat depletion. They embarrassed Nestle. They embarrassed Nestle very publicly and very severely, and Nestle changed its behavior. So those are examples of how the government can set up the rules for information exchange and then leave it to the private sector. But it doesn't always do that. It can also direct the information. And once again, we've got this now familiar space. How would we populate that with the policy instruments? Well, again, we have this, the government can pay for it or the private sector can pay for it. When the government pays for it, it has to decide, are we going to produce the information, or produce the educational tools, produce the persuasive products, or are we going to contract those out to the private sector? Are we going to employ consulting firms? Are we going to employ public education groups? And then down at the bottom we have labeling and mandatory disclosure, where the government says you will share this information. You will tell people what's in your product. You will tell people how much you're emitting. So we could think about some examples of this, again, in our plastic bag application. The government could say, you need to put this bring your own bag label on the end of your checkout counter. Or we can just give this general exhortation, let's put it in the bin, don't throw it on the ground. Or do something drastic, cut the plastic. This is from a California city. All exhortation, trying to persuade people to change their values and thereby change their behavior. Or we can go a step further, and we can try to change people's images of these activities. So, for example, publishing this image which shows bringing your own bag can be very fashionable. Or alternatively, this image which says, we really hate plastic bags, and if you're going to take one, you have to carry this with you, a kind of a badge of shame that you have to carry with you. The point is that there's lots of ways that this information gets out there, and just deciding we're going to share it isn't enough. We need to then go to the next step. How do we move from this substantive policy goal to a concrete action? So just again, I want to emphasize, because this is the step that's most often missed in government activities, is identifying where the problem is, and starting with that. All right, so a few final comments. First of all, organizing the evaluation criteria in the form of a constrained cost minimization approach facilitates the design of the taxonomy and their analysis, and it guides that choice process. The taxonomy itself combines the breadth of the maximalist approach. I actually skipped this point, but there's two different approaches in policy instrument analysis, the maximalist approach and the minimalist approach. The maximalist approach says, let's identify all of the policy instruments and describe each one. The minimalist approach says, let's identify the primary categories of the policy instruments and use that to understand the relation among them. So one of the lists that we looked at said there are actually 3 policy instruments, just 3. They are carrot, stick, and sermon. The carrot gives inducements, the stick punishes behavior we don't like, and the sermon educates. And so we recognize that that both of these have value. And what we're trying to do is combine the explanatory value of the minimalist approach with the breadth of the maximalist approach. Many of these dimensions are continuous, so we don't actually have categories of policy instruments as much as characteristics of policy instruments.